Hello ladies and gents, and today marks a very momentous day in world history, officially the start of WW1. Now most of the commemorations and celebrations occur around November the 11th, but I've decided to do it a little bit differently this year on the start of the First World War. So what better place to remember and commemorate than the Imperial War Museum. Periscope through no man's land.
Non, così, thanks.
Well, you've had your national hero and your everyday hero in our first video, but this is a slightly shorter one, and this covers the men that came back. Our first two heroes in the first video made the ultimate sacrifice in the end, they didn't come back. But in this video we're going to focus on the men that came back. Now, I can't speak for other men's personal experiences. There is a lot written, which obviously you can read about, but personally and known of, I can give you 3 examples from my own family, and that's what we're going to cover in this video. As I say, these are the men that came back, and our first example is Thomas Henry Williams, my mum's granddad, 1894 to 1979, born in Harborne, Staffordshire, and would later move to Birmingham. Thomas's dad, he was a coachman, a domestic coachman for a family at Hanley Castle, not the castle, the place, Hanley Castle in Worcestershire. And Tom would later follow in his dad's footsteps. As technology progressed, he would become a chauffeur, and was a chauffeur gardener. And gardening also ran in that side of the family anyway, from Tom's granddad, so he followed in his father's footsteps, became chauffeur gardener for the same family at Hanley Castle. But yeah, we're going to discuss a little bit of Tom's war now. We don't really have, that I know of in our family, any pictures of Tom before 1927. This is Tom on his wedding day to my great-grandmother, Minnie Bourne, 1927 in Malvern, Worcestershire. As I say, there are no pictures that I know of before 1927. But as my granddad said to me, he chose to wear this, what he's wearing is his military regalia from the First World War. Now, Tom wasn't Scottish. As I say, he was born in Harborne in Staffordshire, but his experiences in the First World War would leave him quite damaged emotionally at one point in the war, and he had to go away to convalescence. And part of his convalescence, the treatments in those days, they got involved with all sorts of things, was music and dancing, and he took to the bagpipes and Scottish country dancing, and that stayed with him all his life, as we'll hear later on in the video. But Tom's war, and he wouldn't really speak much about the war, bits that I know I heard from my granddad, and my granddad only heard these bits when Tom was older, or when my granddad was younger and naughty and earwigging and overhearing things that he shouldn't have been listening to, when Tom was speaking to his brother Frank about wartime experiences. But what we know about Tom is that he saw action at Vimy Ridge. Vimy Ridge, the British were there between 1914 to 1915, and it was a complete and utter failure, if I'm honest with you. Those experiences stayed with Tom, of course, for the rest of his life. It would later be the Canadians that had success at Vimy Ridge, our Canadian friends and allies, on the 9th to the 12th of April 1917, and we see that in this image. And some of the stories and tales that Tom would have heard from the Canadian soldiers, of course, would have stuck with him as well, because they would have passed each other on the way and spoken and exchanged faults and goodness knows what else. Yeah. So that's the first bit I know about him at Vimy, in the very early bit of the war, because like many joined up early. He joined up very early. There was a lot of propaganda, and it was quite effective, unfortunately, and a lot of men joined up. The Battle of Arras was the next one I know about that Tom was in, which was the 9th of April to the 16th of May 1917, and these are original images from the time. What caused the most damage for Tom, particularly emotionally, was Messines, or Messines, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Battle of Messines, the 7th to the 14th of June 1917. Now, the British set off 20 mines before dawn on the 7th of July 1917. It was then the largest man-made explosion ever, about half a kiloton. The explosion was so loud and fierce that it was heard in London. Now, all the troops, not all the ranks were informed of what was going to happen, obviously for obvious reasons, but everyone was withdrawn back far enough and would have known that something was going to happen. So, before dawn, Tom and all his men around him, fighting men with him, would have seen what happened, and it was a terrible thing, a real foul, vile thing. It really was. Warfare is foul and vile, but that's what really stuck with Tom, the memory of the noise, and afterwards what he saw as well. I don't want to go into graphic details out of respect for the men and the horses, because there was a lot of nastiness involved, but that stuck with Tom, and that's what caused his issues, and he ended up in a convalescence centre, and that's where we get the Scottish interest in my great-grandfather from Harborne and Birmingham. It's an interesting one, that. But here, look, is an early colour photograph showing the Messines crater, the aftermath of the, at the time, world's largest controlled explosion, and you can see it's awful, the devastation that it wrought. It really is. So yeah, that's Tom's war and his experiences of what he had. And now for our next example, and you've seen this picture before, is my nan's dad. My nan Liz, this is her dad, Arthur William Price, 1887 to 1952. A local man to me, born in Canning Town, lived in and around Canning Town Custom House and Plaster all his life. Out of the 3 examples that I'm going to show you of my family, Arthur came off the worst. He was gassed 3 separate times throughout the course of the war with mustard gas, and that left him with lifelong physical injuries, and the things that he saw in the war, of course, left him with lifelong emotional injuries too. But this is an image of him with my nan's mum, his wife Maud, early on in the war. He was one of the ones, as I said in the first video, our VC winner and everyday hero. A lot of them joined up early on. But yeah, Arthur, we know he was at the Somme, he was at Ypres in Belgium, and we know he was in Flanders, and that was his last battle in Flanders because he was injured and eventually invalided out. They had to invalid him out as no longer fit for service. That much we do know. His service records, sadly, like many service records from the First World War, were destroyed in the Second World War in air raids. So other than things from field hospitals and stuff like that, and what's passed down to me from my nan, which thankfully she knew quite a bit. So yeah, that was Arthur's War. And our last man, this is my great uncle. This is my great grandmother Ada's brother, Ada Lee, maiden name was. And this man is called Charles Joseph Lee, and he was born in 1886 and died in 1947. Another local man, he was born in Plaistow. He did fairly alright for himself. He worked his way up through dock labouring and things like that, and him and his wife did fairly okay for themselves. But yeah, Charlie, he was in one of the cavalry regiments of the First World War. I did try to colorise this image, but it didn't turn out very good, I'm afraid. But if you look close around his neck, he's got this great big thing around his neck, and I don't know if that's like machine gun bullets or something like that. But yeah, the horses, bless them, poor things, a lot of those were used for transportation and moving people about. We don't really know much about Charlie's War. Very kindly, a distant cousin sent me this image and other images of Charlie, and all we know is that he would never speak about it. And the men that in the cavalry regiments that dealt with the horses, my goodness, did they see some really vile things. Those poor horses and those poor men. But this is some of kind of the stuff that Charlie would have been up to. And the poor horses as well. That much I know from great-granddad Tom, what he said to my granddad Mark, that those poor horses, they drowned in mud, and some of the men wouldn't leave them and went down with them, and some men had to shoot their horses because they couldn't get them out. And I like this, a nice little tribute over to the left, which was done by the men of the cavalry regiments in the First World War, at the end of the First World War, for all the horses that had been lost. Yeah, so that was Charlie's War. That's their wars, and as I say, the men all came back. These men, luckily for them and us in a way, but the men, or emotional scars that they bore, and physical scars, as in Arthur's case. I mean, his health was ruined for the rest of his life because he was gassed 3 times. Yeah, that's their wars, and now we're just going to cover their later lives and the fact that they did survive. Onto that part of the video now. And that's the story of their wars, the 3 that came back, my 3. Proud to call each one of these men an ancestor of mine. And we start off with their lives after the war. Well, with Tom here, as I say, there's no photos of Tom. Thomas Henry Williams, you see this picture of them on their wedding day. Thomas Henry Williams and Minnie Bourne, my great-grandmother and great-grandfather, 1927, Worcestershire. But yeah, there are no pictures of Tom that I know of before 1927, but we do know after Vimy and the psychological problems that it had caused him, he convalesced for a while, got better. The Scottish country dancing, the bagpiping and the convalescing all helped, and he was put back into the army, and he was sent back into the army as a batman, which is a servant to an officer. And that's how Tom served out the rest of his war, and he was discharged in 1919. That much I do know from what my granddad told me. But yeah, this is great-grandparents on their wedding day, Tom and Minnie, 1927, Worcestershire. This is a colorization of the original. And my granddad said this is his military regalia that he was wearing on the wedding day as well. So this gives us a little hint or just to his military career. As I say, he ended his army career as a batman. And this is a nice image that David, my friend, kindly supplied to me. I like this. It's really nice. Shows great-granddad Tom in his military regalia. As I say, each 3 of our men lived after the war, and fairly long after the war as well. Great-granddad Tom's case, he died in 1979 at the age of 85. But as I say, with the Vimy and what it did to him, the convalescing obviously helped him, and so did the Scottish country dancing and the bagpiping, because that stayed with him all his life. And you see him here in a 1950s picture playing the pipes at a charity fundraising contest. My granddad couldn't remember what it was for, but he did remember that it was raising money for something or other. And my mum heard him play the pipes once, her granddad. This is my mum's granddad, and she said he was very good. And here you see this very damaged 1963 photograph. I have tried to repair it, but it's a bit too far gone, and it's the way they're printed. Some of them are pixelated, some aren't, and I have tried everything I can with this one, but yeah, it didn't turn out too good. But here you see Tom right over to the right. There's a 70-odd-year-old man, so an old boy by this time. My mum's a 3-year-old girl. The old lady next to my mum is Tom's sister, Amy. And the lady right over to the left is my mum's mum, Ingrid. And this is in 1963, so Tom was an old boy by this time. But yeah, after he retired and stuff, he had like an allotment garden. He loved his gardening because he was a chauffeur gardener. And as I say, Tom died in 1979 at the age of 85. Thanks again to David for this one, because giving him that picture, this is what he went with and sorted this for me. And my mum said, yeah, it is a really good likeness of her granddad. But yeah, Tom lived long after the war, died at the age of 85. He wouldn't really, as I say, he wouldn't speak about the war much. Bits and bobs my granddad knew. He was told later on, or he heard from earwigging, listening into Tom and his brother Frank talking about things that they'd been through during the war. As kids often do, yeah. That was Tom and his war and afterwards. And as I say, when he came out of the army, chauffeur gardener for the rest of his life for a family at Hanley Castle. And he died at the age of 85, suddenly. So he went the best way, no suffering. And yeah, that was Tom's war and Tom's life. Now on to our next subject, which is my nan's dad, Arthur, great-granddad. And you can see them here, the original picture. Great-grandmother Maud Wanless and great-granddad Arthur Price, Arthur William Price. He was born in 1887, died in 1952. As I say, this is the original, and they'd only been married 3 or 4 years when this picture was taken. Here's a colorization of it. I like this one because the colours turned out very well on this. As I say, Arthur, out the 3 of them, really did have the worst war. He got gassed on 3 separate occasions with mustard gas. Now this is the original with this picture, and if you look over to the right side, to us looking at it, of his face, but what would be the left side of his face, you can see the pitting and scarring, and that isn't an effect or something wrong with the photograph. That is the aftermath and remnants of the mustard gas attack that he was a victim of. This picture was taken in one of the military hospitals, and he would have been wearing his hospital blues at this time. This is the original, but I cleared it up and managed to remove some of the scarring and pitting and stuff, but you can see the left eye is still a bit closed and that, and yeah, that was his war. As sad as the original picture was, my nan always had this picture up on the wall. I think it served as a reminder what he went through. She never missed wearing a poppy, my nan. But yeah, Arthur lived a long time after the war, a really long time after the war. He didn't die until 1952. But Arthur, because of what he went through in the war, and a lot of the men got a shitty deal after, they was promised a land fit for heroes to come back to, and he used to say, land fit for heroes, land fit for fucking nothing. And after his war, he was a real ardent anti-royalist and anti-authoritarian. He did not like royalty or authority. My nan used to laugh because he saw the Queen, the late Queen Elizabeth, her grandfather up at the front once expecting the troops, and his exact words in later life about him was, bastard little monkey on a horse. So you guess you each just as to how you feel about royalty. But yeah, this is the coronation of the Queen's father in 1937. And over to the right is Maud, Arthur's wife. And Arthur, as I say, was an anti-ardent royalist, and he would not get involved with anything like this. He would stay indoors, and that's where he was when this picture was taken. But I thought it's a nice little image from 1937. It shows Arthur's wife, Maud, coronation day, outside their house, a 78 Martindale Road custom house. This would later be bombed just 2 or 3 years later in the Blitz. But standing next to Maud is her niece, Hattie, and the lady over to the left is Maud's sister, Harriet Wanless, also called Hetty. We spoke about Maud and Harriet, her sister, in our documentary about the VC winner and the everyday hero. The everyday hero was Joseph Wanless, the one that was killed at Gallipoli, and Maud over to the right and Hattie over to the left, that's their brother that they lost. So I wanted to show this picture. And here we see Arthur later on in life, and Manan loved this image. Manan's pride and joy when she was a young lady, when she started one of her first jobs and saved up a bit of money, she bought herself a box brownie camera. And this picture was taken in 1939, just a few weeks or months before the war started. Manan remembered that much. And this is in their old yard at Martindale Road. And as you can see, Arthur, he was a rag and bone man after the war because he'd been gassed badly. Before the war, he was a house painter and decorator for West Down Borough Council, but when he came back his health was ruined and he became a rag and bone man. And yeah, here you see him in 1939 with Manan, and I think everything he went through, he's still able to smile like that. It's amazing. He's one of my heroes, actually. I really do admire my great-granddad. And this is a lovely picture, just a couple of months or weeks before the Second World War broke out. This is Arthur, 1950s, very late 40s, early 50s. So this is him towards the end of his life. He died in 1952, age 64. So he was born in 1887, died in 1952. And after their house at Martindale Road got bombed, they moved somewhere else in Custom House, and I can't think for the moment off the top of my head where it was, but they stayed in Custom House. And this is them in their yard there, and he dug a little, or had a little square dug for himself for a little bit of garden. And this is him with his pride and joy, his tulips. He loved his tulips, and this is Arthur just a year or two before he died. And a funny family thing is, he always wore his trousers up high, like that. And I do the same thing, and my nan always used to laugh, said, "Oh, you remind me of my old dad." There we go, that's Arthur. That was his war, and his life after the war. Interestingly enough, in about 1946-47, just after the Second World War, the family thought Arthur had gone mad because he ended up in Goodmayes for a little while, and it was discovered he had an abscess on the brain. Eventually, cut a long story short and rub out all the nasty bits of it, the abscess burst and it cleared itself out and stuff like that, and after that he was totally fine. But my nan always swore blind that gassing during the First World War was the cause of that abscess in the brain in later life. Whether it was or not, we don't know. But he was gassed on 3 separate occasions, as I said, and it did affect him for the rest of his life. The things that he saw emotionally, my nan overheard him once when she was a young girl talking to one of his brothers, and when he was walking through the trenches, they was just about to go over the top, and he trod on something, it squelched, he looked down and it was a human face, a head, and he couldn't even bury it or do anything. And that's not an unfamiliar story, that happened to a lot of the Tommies. But yeah, as I say, Arthur lived on, and he lived until 1952, and this is him just a year or two before he died. That's Arthur's story. Last but definitely not least, my great-grandmother Ada, her brother Charlie, Charles Joseph Lee, 1886 to 1947. This is the original with the picture, him in his cavalry regiment on the horse. Don't know the horse's name, unfortunately, I wish I did. Just a slightly cleared up version with the border and everything taken away. But yeah, Charlie survived the war, and because of the things he saw, he would not speak about the war. That much I do know. We don't know that much about Charlie's war or his life or anything. And sadly, with a lot of the records, they were destroyed. The First World War records, Arthur's records were destroyed. Tom, who we've spoken about, my great-granddad Tom, his records, because he came from Birmingham, and Coventry and Birmingham got the shit bombed out of it. Yeah, a lot of the First World War veterans, their records were destroyed in the Second World War. So it's actually hard to find out a bit about some of them. But yeah, as I say, Charlie lived on, and he lived into a fairly good old age, and they did fairly well for themselves in life. And this is Charles and his wife Elizabeth Webb. This is them at the good old seaside, archetypical seaside British holiday in about 1935. This is Charlie and Elizabeth towards the end of Charles's life. His grandson kindly sent me these photos, and I know this one, it was taken just a year or two before he died. And as I say, he died in 1947. And this is Charlie with his wife Elizabeth. So yeah, that's our 3 men I've chosen to remember today. Their lives, their war, and the fact that they did live on. They are the men that came back. And there's lots of men like that that bore their scars very, very quietly, emotional or physical scars. So, lest we forget, eh?